Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Qdabra's weekly webinar. This is Patrick, and I'm really happy that you all could be here. I'm also happy and pleased to be presenting today from Japan. I'm on a business trip in Osaka, and it's very late here, but wanted to welcome you again. Today's topic is making your forms portable. What does that mean? Well, let's actually ask you a quick question first before we get going. I've got a poll question here, and I want to ask you what you do when you migrate your forms today. So we'll just do this quick poll. Many of you may have discovered that InfoPath forms are very difficult to migrate because of the data connections, and therefore maybe you're manually republishing them and fixing them up when the publish process finishes. That's a nice feature in the publish wizard, but it doesn't always work. And so some people use third-party tools like ShareGate, and Metalogix has one. Maybe you're using something else besides those two. Maybe you're not moving your forms. So it looks like most of you are doing manual publish, 60%, 20 on the third-party tools, and 20 are not doing anything. So thanks a lot for quickly responding to my question there. And it looks like the numbers have just changed, 67, 17, and 17, whatever we make of that. So today we're going to talk and do a demo on a technique that some of you probably are already using. In fact, I see some familiar faces. I know that at least one of you is using this technique. And so, Shane, you're the inspiration for today's webinar. To some degree, we've been making forms portable for many, many years. In fact, back in 2013 in July, we did a webinar on this technique, and it's gotten better over the years. But in general, you want to make your forms location aware. So the forms should know when they're open, where they're opened from, right? So that's the first step, is you got to make sure that the forms can detect where they're opened from. And then you want to use our change connection URL command to update all of your data connections dynamically. Now, to do that, you need to make sure that your data connections are not set to query on load. We'll talk more about that in a minute. The third thing you need to do is the submit URL. So the submit URL, not RL, but URL. The submit URL also needs to be fixed up, changed. And then if you have any list mappings, you'll want to modify those as well. So those are the four things we're going to show today. Any questions? We've got quite a few demos here. So the first technique is adding location awareness. So we have I want to thank Curvy Alphafar, who's one of our latest members here at Qdabra, and she's spent quite a bit of time today working up this wonderful PDF guide that will step you through making changes to the forms. The package you're going to get today actually has it has a starter form in it, so you can use our expense report form, or what you can do is you can use your own form. The same techniques apply. So we've got a nice PDF document here, and this will walk you through the different steps to make your form portable. And the first thing we need to do is we need to set up your site. So if you've got assets like lists and, well, if you've got lists or libraries that you're querying, those lists and libraries have to exist on the target site. So you're going from a source site to a target, and the source site, you've got, typically the forms have data connections to lists or to libraries. Those same lists and libraries need to exist on the target site. To move those lists and libraries, you can actually create STP files. You can use one of those third-party tools. So we're not really talking about that. You still have to move the contents of those lists and those libraries over. What we're talking about today is really, once you've moved those over, how do you make your form super portable, right? So it's easy to move those things over, but the form itself is hard to change because you have to go through and fix up all the data connections and rebind them, and it's really a lot of work. So we don't have to do all that. We can use these techniques today to make the form portable, make it easy to migrate, and we're going to show you how. But you do have to have those lists and libraries already set up. So the first technique I want to show is this this technique to make the form location aware. So in this package today, you're going to have this guide that we're going to walk through. You also have a form that you can start from. We're going to use the expense report form again. We've been using that in webinars quite a bit lately. And this form has a bunch of stuff built in. If you were in our webinars back in March, you saw some of the goodness. This form has a lot of nice features in it. But this is the base form, and the base form actually does not have any location awareness. So let's take a look. So typically, when the form opens, it's going to look at any data connections that are set to open on load. So you can see here at the very bottom in the details section, it will tell you if the data connection is always loaded, right? So I think none of these here, so here's an example. So this one here says every time the form is open. Now this Twilio data connection is actually, I believe it's an XML file. So in this case, because it's built into the form, it's okay. It can be data retrieved every time the form is open because there's no external dependency, right? So it's not going to fail to load because the Twilio resource file exists in the form right there. Okay, so but that's an example of where that message is going to show up. Now, with our library and we've got a library that we're going to submit to. We're also querying that library. We're going to get the user's profile information. We've got a policy for the expense report. So these are all examples of data connections that the form relies on. And you want to make sure that those data connections don't have, if they're external, they don't have the message every time the form is open. If they do, then on your source site, you want to go back and change those to be not automatic. Otherwise, the form will try to query them and will fail. And the key technique that we're showing today requires that you fix up the data connections after the form loads. And the way you do that is you're going to add a rule. And the first thing we need to do is we need to identify where the form opened from. So you can see here we've got a bunch of different rules. You can ignore most of these. We're doing things like loading one of these CSS style sheets. It's actually a cascading style sheet that is going to make the form look good on mobile. We're doing a bunch of things. We're setting up a Twilio account to text people. We've shown some of these techniques in previous webinars. You can just kind of ignore all this. What we're going to do though is we're going to add a rule in this finished loading field that automatically queries and gets the current location. And to do that, you're just going to add a rule here. You're just going to add a rule, and the rule is going to be get location or something like that. And the action is going to be to set the command in qRules to be get input parameter, and the key is going to be sp host URL. So when the form opens, it's going to have this in the URL. So let's take a look. I've already actually done this with this form here, and you can see that I called it get site URL in this form, and this is exactly the same command. It's getting the input parameter where the key is equal to sp host URL. And then what it does is it sets the site URL equal to the result of that command. So the site URL is where I'm storing that location. I'm also displaying it in the form at the bottom in the footer. I have a site URL as just a calculated value there, so it'll tell me where the site was published, where the form is opened from. So if I am in FormsViewer, so let's go to my site now. So here's my new site. I just set this up for this webinar today, and in this site, if I just go to open up my form, so I've actually created a library. I've configured it to open the form from FormsViewer. And if I click new here, it's going to automatically open the form, and it's going to detect where it was published from. And you can see down at the bottom, I've got that open location. And this is, of course, a responsive designed form, so that CSS allows us to there's no white space on the sides. It's a nice layout. It wraps. But what we're really showing in this webinar today isn't that we've showed that the CSS stuff before. What we're showing today is that we're automatically detecting where the form is opening from. And we also have this debug screen in here, so we can look at that command is right here, and the command is actually successful, and it's actually getting this result. So that's the first step, is you want to actually get the location where the form is open from. Now, if you look at this URL here, this is the URL from the form, right? Let's take a look at this in Notepad, and you can see here that SP host URL is the first parameter right there, and it's got an URL encoded, so it's got all these special characters are encoded, like 3A is of course colon and 2F is slash. But you can see that there's the actual location right there, and then we get the next parameter, which is SP language. But you can see what we're doing with that input parameter command is we're actually just querying where the location is, and this is actually a better technique than hard coding it. So the other way you could do it is you could just, in your form, you could just have on load, you could just say, well, I'm going to just type it in. So you could actually have, instead of it automatically detecting where the site URL is, you could just set it right here. You could just say, hey, site URL is going to equal, and then you just type this in, right? Or whatever. The problem is that you'll always have to type it in over and over again. And if we use the command technique, the get input parameter, then the same form can be used, or it can be published anywhere, and it doesn't have to be fixed up manually. So it's automatic. So that's the first technique. So the second technique, and I just talked about that statically setting it. That's the first demo, two techniques. One is to use a get input parameter. The other is to automatically just type it in. Obviously, we want to do the first technique for the location awareness. Now, once we've done that, now what we can do is we can actually query data connections, and we can change the connection URL so that any of those data connections that were there can get fixed up automatically and point to the new site. So let's take a look at an example of this. In the form, I've got a rule here that is saying, so I've got, I need to go up here a little bit. I've got a lot of rules in here. So I've got this fix submit data connection, and I've got the fixed list data connection. Let's take a look at this one. So this is actually setting a command, and you can see that what it's doing is I don't know if I can make this any bigger, but what it's doing is it's running a command to change the connection URL for the SharePoint list data connection, and the URL, the new URL, is going to be equal to the site URL, the one we set using the first technique, right? And then it's going to concatenate the rest of it on. So whenever you have a list command that requires the list.asmx web service in SharePoint, you need to fix that up, right, if the form moves to new site, and it has to point to the list.asmx web service on the new site. And the way we're fixing that up is we're running this change connection URL command with the new site URL in it. So this is actually the parameter that we just set. So that's an example of changing a connection, changing a data connection using the new location variable that we created. If we go back to our form in the debug window, you can see here that there's where the command is right there, and you can see how it's actually incorrect. We have a bug in here, Kirby. What's interesting is it is succeeding, but it's incorrect. So it actually should have a slash there. So let's fix this. It's important that when you're doing this, that you have the site URL is going to equal, what did we see? We saw the site URL is equal to, didn't have a slash at the end. So we need to make sure that we add a slash here to fix that. Okay. And it will succeed even if it's incorrect, because there's no validation happening with it changed the connection URL, but thankfully we're not using that anywhere else below, at least in this case, but we do need to fix it. So once again, with FormsViewer, it's easy to update these items. We're just going to go to FormsViewer and I'll update it, drag and drop the new form, and show you how easy it is to publish. One of the nice things, in addition to the fact that you can make your forms portable, you can actually make the publish process a lot easier, because you don't have to wait for the publish wizard to finish. So I believe the form I just saved is right there. Looks like it has not updated the timestamp. I've got some problem with my Dropbox, but let me just check to make sure the version is correct. So this is version number 1284. So we're just going to ignore the timestamp and upload it anyway. So I believe this is the correct one. And then we'll go back to the site. So previously we had 1283, and now we're going to open up the new one with the fix and make sure that that connection URL is correctly concatenating. And we go to the debug screen again. So 1284 is correct, and now we should have, yeah, that's the correct one, right? Because you want to make sure that, and the way to test it is you can actually just copy the result into the browser, and it should give you a valid page like that. So, so that fixed that. The previous version didn't have that. So that's the second technique. The second technique, or the second demo, is to update those query data connections. Now we actually have another one in the form. The other one I wanted to show you was for policies. So we have a separate page in here, policy page, where we're actually loading the policy. So if they had a question about the expense reports, like, what's the policy, they can actually click on the policy button in the upper right hand corner on the main view, and they'll switch to here. Now here on the policy page, and actually let me just show you this in the browser here. So I think this is the one, the 1284, that's the previous one. Let's make sure we have the most recent one here. So here's the one I just opened. If I click on policy, you'll see that I've got, it should default to one of these, but it's automatically pulling in the language that I select at the top. And it's doing it dynamically. So this is a very clever technique. And the way we're doing this is we're actually using the same command, change connection URL, to dynamically change the resource file that's actually external. So that in this case, we're actually loading a resource file that is external to the form. It's an XML file in a library. And we're using the same command, change connection URL, with the DS names policies, that's the data connection name, and then the URL is policy URL. Now policy URL is also created from site URL, and I didn't show you that to begin with, but if we go back to our finished loading commands, you'll see that underneath here, when I set up my site URL, the next thing I do is I set the policy URL equal to the site URL. So I'm actually just saying the policy URL equal to the site URL with the expense report policy. So it's a library underneath that site. So we're just setting that up based on the location where it opens from. And then in this case, we're actually running the command to change the connection URL for the policy's data connection to that new location. And then there's a little dot here. I don't know if you can see that. There's a little dot there that corresponds to the language .xml. So let's take a look at this library. So in this site, we've got an export expense report policies library. So I can actually go in here and I can fill out a new policy. Let's say I want to use French or something. So I can say, I I don't speak French, but if I can put in here, I can put in some, I can go to Google and I can translate it. But let me just, for the purpose of this little demo here, say I'm just going to type in some French, and the French is going to be 1, 2, 3, just to show you that this is actually live. We don't even have to reopen the form. Well, we do, because we don't have the item in the list. But we could have a refresh button as well. Now if I open it again, it's going to query, it doesn't actually query the library until we go here, and now you can see, no, it's actually, I'm trying to think here, it is not querying the library. Or is it? Did I add to the right library? I forget. Let me go back to our policies. So English, Filipino, and there's our French one, right? So I believe that the form should be querying those policies and listing them all out here. And I think the problem is that this dropdown is hard-coded right here. So if we actually add French, now we would want this to be, of course, dynamic. But for the purpose of this quick demo, let's just go with the static. We'll add the form back to FormsViewer, just to show you that it will be dynamic. The labels in the dropdown aren't. They should be. It should be querying that library. We could add a data connection to do that. And I'm going off my demo script as usual, but this will just take a second. So we'll make this update. And now if I go back to my expense reports and click new, on the policy page, we should have 4 items now, and that will bring in the 1, 2, 3. So it is actually pulling those in dynamically. Like I said, it would be better if this dropdown was also pulled in from the library. To do that, we would just add a change connection URL to that policies library. The form itself has a data connection to load the XML contents, and that's right here at the top. You can see that it's got a connection to, it hard codes to English, and you have to actually specify an existing XML for these kinds of things. So there has to be at least one item in a library to begin with, because it has to infer the schema, the data source for this secondary data source. In this case, we just have 3 fields: ID, title, and text. And then once you've done that, then you can change the connection URL from English to French to Japanese to Filipino, whatever. Okay, so that's the second technique to change the connection URL to automatically. You can do it on the fly in the case of the dropdown, or you can do it at the beginning of when the form opens on finish loading. The next technique is for submit. So submit's a little bit different. You can use change connection URL for submit, but you can also use the change submit URL command. And what this does is it just changes where the form is going to be submitted to make sure it's submitted to the site where you've got the form published. Pretty straightforward. If we go back to our form in the, let's see here, I'll type in some values here. Team picnic, springtime, and we'll make it morale, and the description is going to be sandwiches. And where are we going to get them? We'll get them from some sandwich shop called Joey's. And we'll spend $65. Okay, so if I submit this now, of course it can't be in the future, so we've got some validation in the form. Then if I go down to my debug screen, you'll see that there's a command in the form to change the submit URL right there. It's actually on loads when this is happening. So that was successful, and if we go back to the form library and hit refresh, we should see that new item appear. And there it is, Pink Team Picnic at the bottom there. Okay, so that's the third technique, or the third demo, and that is to update the submit connection. Once again, if you're migrating from one site to another, if you manually publish it, then the publish wizard will give you at the very end an option to fix up the data connections. And that will usually work. But what won't work is if you're doing any of these dynamic things, you can't obviously do that. So the drop down to pull in the policies would not be handled by any of the third-party migration items, nor would it be handled by the publish wizard and InfoPath. In addition, there's cases where the publish wizard won't work, especially if you're going from one site to another and they're in the same site collection. So the site, if they're in the same site collection, the publish wizard won't actually see a difference in the server name, so it won't actually try to fix up the data connections, and then you have a real problem. The last demo I want to show today is this list mapping. So we have a command in FormsViewer and qRules to submit repeating data to a list. In this case, we have created two lists, a parent list where we have the expense report items. In this case, we just have the one Team Picnic. I deleted the ones from the previous two items. So you just see this one I just submitted. And then underneath that, we have the children items. So you see there's the one sandwiches there. If there were two, it would show two. And it would have the report ID being the same. So there's a parent-child relationship there. It doesn't make sense if it's not repeating, but it will do it if it's repeating. Now, when you have a list mapping, the list mapping is defined in qRules to map to any number of arbitrarily deep parent-child, grandchild lists. It can also have lists at the same level. You can map it, all the repeating data, to any number of lists. It's a great command. But you want to fix that up to make it dynamic as well, because if you're moving from one site to another, obviously the publish wizard in InfoPath won't even detect the list mapping stuff at all. So this will fail guaranteed. So you have to have some way of fixing this. How do you do it? So in the form, if we go back to our finished loading, which is where all the action happens on open, then you'll see in here that we're fixing up the mapping data. Now, in the qRules mapping, if you look at the data source, we actually have the mapping defined as a secondary resource. And for those of you familiar with mapping, you inject the form with qRules, you add the mapping. There's some steps to do this. You can, in FormsViewer, it's actually a lot simpler because you can just do it via the UI. I'm not going to go into that today, but suffice to say, there is a SharePoint list URL in the mapping. So the actual, when you're mapping to a list, you need to know where it's going. And all we need to do to make it dynamic is just set that to be equal to the new site. So it's really that simple. So if you go back to qRules, finish loading, you'll see that this list mapping data connection, there's no command here, it's just a set value. So it's just setting that value, SharePoint list URL equal to site URL. And that's the SharePoint list URL in that secondary data source. So that's how simple it is. So that's the fourth demo, and that makes it really easy to do that. You can also use change connection URL to do the same thing, because change connection URL will update that data connection, but it's simple to do it with a set value. Okay, so today we've got all these techniques, and like I said, Kirby's prepared this wonderful document to step you through it. I've actually gone through this. It talks about exactly what I showed, adding the site URL to your form, so you have the location. And if you add these new fields, it's not going to have any problem with the old forms because it's just a new field. So the But if you do have an old form and you want to open that form to edit it, then it won't work, obviously, because the site URL won't be in there. So that's a little bit of a challenge there. So it's mainly what we're showing here is for new forms for the new site. To do old forms, to open up old forms, what you can do is you can use the same technique, but you just need to have a secondary data source where you can store that site URL when the form opens, and then you can actually set up all your data connections there. Because this is in the main data source, if you're trying to edit an existing form, like all the forms, you migrate them all over, you try to open up an existing one, it won't have site URL in it. So it won't actually be able to set that. So you'll have to add it to a secondary data source, which is pulled in automatically by a FormsViewer or InfoPath on open. Just one catch there. But you can see in her document, she talks about how to do the get input parameters to fix your data connections up, and then the technique to so we're setting up the change connection URL command, and then changing the list mapping by setting that value, and then fixing the policy data connection to automatically change when the dropdown changes. So it's all pretty well spelled out, and you'll get in the package the starter form, expense reports. You'll get the end result that you can compare it to. If you didn't get the result that we did, you can look at what we did and see how we changed it. So it's like more of a verification. There's also a policy form for creating those policies, and there's a bunch of configuration for FormsViewer, configuration files that you may need, and some STPs that define lists and libraries. So pretty much everything is there, and I went through everything before the webinar this morning, so verify that everything is working. We also have the presentation, of course, and that's about it. So any questions for me? Next week, we're going to be talking about syndicating list forms. So list forms actually cannot be republished today. List forms are tightly coupled with the schema in the list. So if you're trying to take one list form and move it to another list, no, you can't do it. But you can if you have FormsViewer. So Jimmy Risch, our #1 FormsViewer developer in the world today, he's going to be doing next week's webinar on that technique. He's also got a tool that will allow you to create lists and libraries automatically. So for those of you who have like a 365 site like Shane that has, and you want all of your customers to be on subsites, you can create all of these subsites automatically and then syndicate your form across all of them. And that's pretty cool. So questions for me? I want to thank you all for being patient with me and going through this webinar demos. It doesn't look like we have any questions. So just to recap then, we have a migration path for you. InfoPath is still there, but Microsoft has said that they are discontinuing support in 2025. So we have an option for you, and that's called FormsViewer. It's the lowest cost option out there. It not only is it zero cost or very minimal if you're using our cloud-based instance where we have to pay Microsoft for processing CPU time a little bit for Azure, but it's also it's zero to minimal effort to migrate the forms over. Really, most of the forms just migrate as is. There's really no change. There's a few things that aren't supported, but you can work around those. There's better features than InfoPath. We've extended InfoPath to use 60 of these qRules commands, of which we showed 3 or 4 of them today. It's a faster experience. We've got support for mobile, and so on and so on. We've got a class coming up. We just did class last week. We're going to do a FormsViewer training class in May. To register, just go to Education on our homepage, Classes, and you can register there. Hope to have you there. Class size is limited. Don't forget, it's free. And thanks, Alan, for that wonderful comment. Hope you can all make it next week. Jimmy will be here. I'm going to be on vacation. Hope everyone has a great day. Thanks for being here.